Testing, testing, testing. 1, 2, 3.
I just read a novel set in the silent days, and it talks about clack went the focusing board.
Oh. Not heard that one before.
This is an interview with Kevin Brownlow, a face-to-face, sort of, in 4 parts. And the first part is on your early life. I want to start off by asking you, where were you born and when?
I was born in Crowborough in Sussex in 1938.
Who were your parents?
My father was an artist, became a commercial artist called Thomas Brownlow, and my mother was also an artist from a family called Fortnum, but alas, no relation to Fortnum and Mason. And her name was Nina Brownlow.
Did you have any siblings?
No, I had no siblings, mercifully. Just cousins who came and wrecked my train set.
So were you a lonely child?
No, not at all. I can't remember ever being lonely.
Wasn't your father a poster designer?
My father reluctantly went into the commercial art business and became the crack lettering man on British film posters. He worked particularly for Pulford Publicity, and they had the contract for Rank, Disney, Ealing, and you think all that lettering was printed. I can't think why it wasn't, but the poor man stood all day long in the studio with these incredibly fine brushes, and then at night during the war he had to be air raid warden on the roof of the building watching for the incendiaries coming down. It was quite a life, quite a life.
And do you have any of his posters?
He brought them home. I put them up on the wall, and I remember the Bells Go Down, The Magnet, Oliver Twist, funnily enough, but they've all disappeared.
What is your earliest memory?
My earliest memory is extremely unspectacular. It's an extreme long shot behind my mother at a swimming pool in a nearby town, and I am told that memory is at the age of 2. It's certainly very low angle.
Do you remember the war years? And does the war, particularly with Germany, did it make you in any way anti-German?
I certainly remember the war years with incredible vividness, and it's had an effect on me all my life, as you may guess. I've never lost interest in it, and I've never lost the obsession with trying to explain what the Germans did, or at least trying to understand it. And I still haven't got anywhere near it. I just don't understand it. And now that so many other countries are taking part in the same kind of activity, I don't understand them either. I just cannot get it into my head that anyone could treat anyone else like that. But it turns out my father, having been in the island during the Troubles, he used to tell me what the British were up to, and I'm sure that had a certain effect on a certain film that I made.
I remember once actually phoning Dennis Gifford up, and occasionally I'm a bit silly on the phone, and I said Guten Tag or something like that, and he put the phone down on me. Very anti-German, and even more anti-Japanese. I actually find quite a few of my friends of my age won't go and see a Japanese film or have a Japanese video or DVD in their home because they think the Japanese were much worse than the Germans, how they treated the British prisoners. But that's not a question, that's just a comment on that. Were you evacuated?
When the Blitz started, my parents decided we ought to get as far away as possible. So we went up to her sister and her husband, who was a Presbyterian minister. But the Presbyterian minister did not want us there, and we only stayed a few days, and we were sent back to London. Apparently a German bomber had dropped its load and hit a rabbit, and they were very frightened up there, hence the song. That's the story anyway. But it was I do remember that. I was still only 2, and I remember maybe because my mother's repeated the story so often over the years, but again, the angle is right, and I'm not in the shot, as always that betrays that it's not a true memory.
Are all your memories then have film angles in them?
I'm aware of the film angles, yes. Everything's connected with film. It would drive anybody crazy if they weren't interested in cinema.
Do you remember rationing? And if so, did you have a ration book?
Yes, I had a ration book, and I certainly remember rationing, because after all it went on into the 50s. But I haven't any good stories about it, just queuing up with my mother and later on queuing up on my own with the ration books. My God, what a different country this was in those days.
So when was your first real fried egg?
They tried to... I was not evacuated exactly, but I was sent to boarding school at the age of 3, which I suppose is the same thing. And they tried to give us a proper cooked breakfast of dried eggs. The very word. It was so disgusting, I used to throw up. And it put me off bacon and eggs for decades. The food was vile during the war, I cannot tell you. Only my grandmother, who incidentally came from the West Indies, only my grandmother managed to produce food that I really enjoyed. And then my mother had a period of turning vegetarian during the war, and that was even worse. Oh, God, vegetarian nutmeg steak was bad enough, but then came vegetarian jelly. That put me off being a vegetarian forever.
You mentioned your grandmother from the West Indies. Whereabouts? What?
She was from Trinidad. She was the daughter of the governor of Trinidad and Tobago, and yet she spoke with a slight West Indian accent. So when the West Indians came to England in the 50s, I thought they all sounded like my grandmother. She was the... What?
Every island has their own accent. Have you noticed that, actually, from West Indies?
It would be difficult for me to detect, but her brother was being taken off to school in England, and he was on the poop deck of the steamer, and he just dived over the stern and swam back, and married locally. So we have black cousins.
Interesting. Did you have a nanny?
No.
What are your earliest school memories?
Oh, God.
If you want to talk about them, you don't have to.
No, the school was a fascinating place. Do you remember, if you go back that far, the poem about the man at the gate that King George VI read out on the broadcast in 1940? It was a very famous poem. And it was written by one of the schoolmistresses that ran this little school, and all the press came swarming down when it was revealed who'd written it. They were an intriguing group of extremely Victorian ladies, and that school put me off anything Victorian for a long time. I couldn't understand John Betjeman for a while. But they had been a regular school, and they'd sent all their pupils to Canada, and then they reduced the fees for war work. So there were some children there whose parents just left them there. And some of them were in prison camps in the Far East, and some were at the front. Mm. So if you talked to each one, you probably got quite a tragic story. Mm. And
how old were you when you were there? What ages?
From 3 till 7, I think.
And I mean, did you still see your parents in holidays when you were 3 or 4?
I didn't. I sometimes stayed the holidays as well at this school. And what was exciting was later on when the V1s began. And I remember seeing this extraordinary aircraft going across, which appeared to be on fire because a flame was coming out of its rear end. It was making a terrible racket. And I rushed into the school to tell them about this, and they were dishing out Ministry of Food orange juice. They obviously thought we were as traumatized as they were. Of course, we were thrilled to bits and rushed out to look for another one to get some more orange juice. And I remember them at the evening going towards London with flocks of birds after them, which obviously thought this was a new and impressive leader. And then after D-Day, we had the Bren gun carriers lining the road outside the school, and I used to get bilious attacks all the time, and I had just had one and missed being shown around all these vehicles by the soldiers. They were giving us kids a wonderful time, and I missed that. It's one of the most irritating things I can remember. But what we had to do, we had a summer house in the field nearby next door to the school. And the troops used to make a hole in the hedge to sit in the summer house while we pushed them round. That was how life was led before June the 6th, 1944. And then the V1s got even worse. And I learnt since that they moved all the anti-aircraft guns down to the coast. And we used to see this incredible firework display of black flak all over the sky while these aircraft, if you can call them that, got through without
We got clobbered in Streatham actually, V1s and V2s. We were hit. In fact, they destroyed one of the cinemas there.
Really?
Which was storing materials there. In fact, there was a filmmaker, a film cameraman killed in '44 by one of them. I can't remember his name now. Gone from me. At the age of 7, then, where did you go after that?
Then I went to another school, a prep school in the same town, which was really grim. The other one I thought was, but it wasn't. It was paradise compared to this next one, where you had to call everybody sir, all the masters sir, and it was on the usual military lines. But the headmaster did one extraordinary thing. Every third Sunday in the winter, he would show us 9.5 films rented from Wallace Heaton. And so we would see the films of my parents' generation. But the one I remember was not a silent film. It was a mute talkie. In other words, it was a sound film with the sound stripped off, replaced by titles, put out. It's a 1933 version of Oliver Twist with Dickie Moore. And it jammed in the gate, and several frames fell down beside me. And to show how technically sophisticated I was, I rushed up to my dormitory, pitch black, picked up a torch, held the frames, stood in the middle of the room, and switched on the torch, expecting to see a theatre-quality image on the wall. I was so disappointed. But it made me go on and on at my parents for a projector. And when I was 10, I got a projector. The only thing I'd left off was film projector. And they gave me a slide projector. I remember being bitterly disappointed and never touching it. My mother remembers I never stopped using it, which is an interesting comparison. But when I was 11, they gave me a Pathoscope 9.5 Ace projector with a couple of films, and that's when my passion for the cinema began.
Did they take you to the cinema? I mean, you mentioned that 9.5 film. Was that your first film experience, or were there earlier ones? I was
born to be something to do with film, because at that first school, we never saw any films. So I'd never been to the cinema. But the Dr. Bernardo's used to arrive once a term to collect their little cottage. Do you remember that cottage that you put the money through the roof? And they would, as a reward, they would show us home movies shot at their orphanages. And although I'd never seen a film, I knew that these were the most terrible films possible to see. The camera went like this, and everything was out of focus, and they were boring, and I couldn't believe them. Then when I was taken to the cinema in Tunbridge Wells, Snow White, of course, the newsreel came on as I went through the door, and I saw something that imprinted itself on my mind, and it's never gone. The most perfect black and white 35mm cinematography. That's what it should look like, not that dreadful Bernardo stuff. A camera steady, the focus sharp, and black and white, and it looked beautiful. I've never lost my affection for black and white. But I've also still technically slightly unsophisticated, because I thought that the three naval officers were going to fall out of the screen onto the floor. They were walking straight towards the camera, and I couldn't understand it when they went safely to the side and disappeared.
What was the film? Do you remember?
It was a newsreel.
Ah, you do.
Yes.
Right. Apart from the cinema, did you ever go to theatres or pantos?
I was taken to Peter Pan at the Scala, which became Channel 4. I remember getting up out of my seat when when the pirates had the kids in a semicircle telling them a story, and I was almost down the aisle onto the stage before my mother caught up with me and hauled me back.
Did you ever want to become a projectionist?
Just before we leave the theatre, I was then cast as Simple Simon in a play at school, which one of the mistresses wrote. And I was then promoted to the lead, Mayor of Toy Town. I had to have a cushion underneath my costume. And at the next school, I played Friar Tuck in Robin Hood, and I had to have a cushion under my... I was always playing fat parts for some reason. I took to the theatre, but I didn't like it.
Do you have photographs still of you in these characters? Do they ever?
Mercifully not. I have programs, 1946, yes.
Did you have an ambition to be an actor then?
I had absolutely no ambition to be an actor, and I didn't like the suspense that went with the theatre. What I liked was getting it all done and putting it in a can. At least that later on became the aim, that you did everything, put it in a can, and nobody could ruin it. But you then mentioned projectionists, and I've been absolutely staggered how projectionists can ruin the film just as well as a bad theatrical performance. I had no desire to be a projectionist, but obviously that was what I was aiming for, because my mother eventually gave me a camera because she thought I was going to become a projectionist and thought I ought to be a filmmaker. But I used the camera out of a sense of duty. She'd given it to me, it ought to be used. I never really wanted to be a filmmaker. I wanted to be a projectionist with my own theatre, able to choose what I showed the audience.
So you didn't make home movies then?
So then dutifully made home movies, yes. And again, and I still have them. And the first film was exactly like the Dr. Bernardo's one. My mother said, make it a film about Hampstead. So I went off to get photographs of the buildings, and I couldn't fit them into my viewfinder. So I took them in stories, the top story, and the next one in sweeps. And I thought that answered the problem. When the film came back, there's something wrong with the camera. By this time I got to know a film library which had become a photographic shop run by J.M. Burgoyne Johnson, and I took it to him. Now, he'd been a cameraman in the Navy, and he was also extremely tactful, and he just said, don't move the camera. And that piece of advice was priceless, because when I didn't move the camera, the shots were not bad. I had an instinct, obviously, about framing and lighting and so on. And so I was encouraged, that was fatal, encouraged to the point where, yes, I began to make a proper home movie, which was based on a story we'd been doing at school in the French class. Guy de Maupassant's story about the Franco-Prussian War, which I updated to World War II because I knew I couldn't get costumes for the Franco-Prussian War.
Is that how it all started then?
And that's really how it all started.
And do you still have that bit of film?
What happens when I joined the film industry years later? I worked above a projectionist, and he was in a sea of cans. He sort of kicked them around when he walked, but he made a path. But there was a sea of cans, and I once asked him, what are all those films? He said, they're people's first films. They come to have them shown, and they leave them behind. And I did exactly the same thing. I had a friend who lived in Platts Lane who had a lodger called Gus. And I took my film to Gus one day, and when he wasn't looking, I put it inside his wardrobe on a shelf, left it there, never saw it again. I'm now rather hoping that somebody's got it, it would turn up, because I'd be intrigued to see.
Yes. Go back to Platts Lane and see if the descendants of Gus still living there. But
Well, that
going
was...
back to acting slightly, isn't it true that you went to audition for Oliver in Oliver Twist?
No. What happened was my mother told me that she put my name up, but I was not called, which I find extremely odd because, number one, if she'd sent a photograph, they could have seen I looked half-starved. I was always been very thin. Number two, my name was Brownlow, which is the name that the family that Oliver Twist eventually rejoins. Number three, the boy that got the part came from my school.
And that was, what was his name?
John Howard Davis. But even more of a coincidence, he ended up at Thames Television with me, running Light Entertainment.
Monty Python, wasn't it, and stuff?
Really? He was first class, an awfully nice bloke, but I still get irritated when I think of that. I could have been a contender.
Was that the only audition that your mother put you up for? Were there any others?
No.
That's strange, isn't it? They should just choose that one.
It was because there was a trailer shown in the cinemas appealing for boys, and also it was in the Leader magazine. There was an article. My father used to bring home the Leader, Picture Post, Everybody's, all those wonderful magazines at the time, and I remember it was in the Leader.
Right. Were there any cinemas around where you lived?
Yes, there was a Shipman and King cinema in Crowborough, and that we used to go to. I have a record in a letter that I saw California there and didn't think much of it, a Western in the 40s. I remember expecting to see My Friend Flicker, but a scarlet fever epidemic broke out and I wasn't allowed to go, which was incredibly frustrating.
You didn't live in London at all then?
Well, hang on. Then there was another cinema. The first cinema I went to was in Tunbridge Wells. It's just about to be demolished, the Ritz, and that's where I saw Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And I didn't tell you, I ran out screaming.
Why?
Well, was it the Wicked Queen or the Wicked Witch? What was she in Snow White? I can't remember.
Oh, the Wicked Witch of the North, was that?
The Wicked Witch terrified me, and I had to be calmed down and persuaded back into the cinema. And the only time I've ever needed to be persuaded back into a cinema. When we came to London in 1949, the Odeon Swiss Cottage was the one I went to, which in those days must have seated about 2,000 people. It was gigantic.
Was it Saturday morning pictures, or did you?
I never went to Saturday morning pictures. I don't know why. Probably because we went so often to the regular pictures and queued. It was almost always you had to queue.
And what did you used to go and watch? Do you remember any particular films from that period?
I remember Lease of Life with Robert Donat. I remember Father Brown series. My mother was very keen on Alec Guinness. I also remember my mother getting extremely annoyed because a film was showing at another cinema called the Playhouse in Southend Green, called a reissue of a silent film called The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And she thought it outrageous that this dreadful German film about lunatics should be revived. That was in the 50s. Still prejudice against it. What else did I see? Later on I saw a Kirk Douglas picture, The Big Sky, was it?
No art films?
Yes, I was taken to the Everyman so often. I remember seeing the first Chaplin film. My first Chaplin film was the 1942 reissue of The Gold Rush. I never thought of it as a comedy. I was absolutely emotionally wiped out by that picture, and they didn't come to his party. And years later I showed The Kid to my daughter when she was 8, and she was in floods of tears. And I said, well, weren't you amused by the funny bits? And she said, what funny bits? And then I saw a most moving Russian film called My Childhood by Donskoy.
Yeah. Trilogy.
What?
It's a trilogy, isn't it?
Yes, the other two aren't as good. The first one is absolute masterpiece, and I met Donskoy in Moscow years later. So that was, and I also was taken to see Beauty and the Beast, which I found a bit boring, and Orphe, things like that. Yes, I wasn't very turned on by those as a kid.
What about the Festival of Britain? Do you remember that?
Oh yes. That had 3D films at Battersea Park and at the Telecinema. The Festival of Britain was absolutely mind-boggling. It was so wonderful. It was such a difference to the very, very dour and dirty and immediately post-war London. Not that I wasn't very fond of it. I loved the London of that time, and I still get a kick out of seeing footage of it at that period.
You didn't go, there wasn't, the National Film Theatre didn't start about that period, did it, about the time of
That was the Telecinema, which was still showing 3D films, and it was showing a series called The Stars That Made the Cinema. And there was one extract from Buster Keaton's The General, and I was shocked to the core because it made fun of a man being killed. You remember the spy, not the spy, but the sniper that picks off the Canon crew one by one, and Buster's trying to point out where he is, and he does that, gestures with his sword, and the blade isn't attached to the hilt, and the blade ends up between this fellow's shoulder blades. Gets the biggest laugh in the picture now, but in those days it was deathly silence. Somebody making fun of of killing.
Was it around this period that you met Abel Gance, or was it a bit later?
Oh, gosh, there's so many threads.
Because it was around, wasn't the NFT first?
My 9.5mm projector, I ran these 2 films, Mickey Mouse and another one, and then went out to get some more. Do you want this story? Because it's sort of essential. I'll have to tell you whether you've heard it 1,000 times or not. In those days, kids could just walk around London perfectly safely. At least everybody thought they could. And at weekends, I would just, on a Saturday morning, I would just take off for Church Street, and I was collecting antiques in those days for a museum. I'd run the museum at school. Now I'm in London. And I went to Baker Street for some reason and found a photographic shop and asked them if they had any 9.5 films. And the assistant produced this pile of black cassettes, black chargers that looked like that. And on the edge was the title of the film. And I'd heard of none of them. But I thought, they'll fit my projector all right. 1 and 6 are real, just about had enough to cover. And I took them home and showed them to my parents. Now, the first one I ran was missing the first little charger. So I did not know who was in it or what the title was, except that it had the first man around the side. My mother recognized Douglas Fairbanks. Well, even I'd heard of Fairbanks, probably because of Junior. So I got quite excited by this. Then the next one had William S. Hart. The next one had Bessie Love. I'd really got the creme de la creme. So I thought I must find out more about this film, find out what it was called. And what I thought I could do was go to the local library, take a book down, open it up, and there it would be a picture for my film plus a description. So I went to the library and I took the book down, and it fell open at a picture from my film and a description. It was called American Aristocracy, and it was made in 1916. It was a big success for Fairbanks, and I thought, my God, if I've got a film that's in a book, this is too much. I must keep on looking. So I became a film collector, absolutely passionate film collector. I would stand outside the gate of our house waiting for the postman with a parcel. And I built up quite a large collection, but they were all 9.5. Then one day I got a French film called Lion of the Moguls. And now people had told me that silent films were pathetic. They were jerky, flickery, ludicrous antiques. That's what this one was. This really answered all those, ticked all those boxes. And it's very unfair because years later I saw the whole film and it's not nearly as bad as it was in this version, which was appallingly printed for some reason, and it just badly abridged. I had to get rid of it. And so I rang the library and they said, well, the only film we've got left is Napoleon Bonaparte and the French Revolution. I said, oh, I don't want that. That'll be a classroom film. There are an awful lot of attempts to be educational with home movies. And I said, it's all we've got. I said, okay, send it. I can't have this one around any longer. So I sent that one back, and a couple of days later I was in bed with flu, home from school, and I got this parcel with these 2 reels in it. And I set up, I still get a frisson when I think of it. I set up the projector, got my parents in the front room, and I ran them this film on the wall. Well, first of all, it looked like an 18th century newsreel. It was so authentic. The faces were perfect. The costumes, I knew nothing about the period really, but you could see that everything was spot on. But it used the camera in a way I'd never even thought of. But when I saw it, I realized this is true cinema. This is what you never saw at the Odeon, and you certainly never saw at school. And I remember my mother saying at the end, that's the most beautiful film you've got. And I discovered that there were several more reels. And so I advertised and hunted around until I got all 6 reels. And this became an obsession. And I wrote a letter to the director wondering, well, I mean, the film was only 30-some years old. Maybe he's still alive. And I got an answer. And I tried to find out more. I even spoke to a film journalist who had a photograph of him. And I showed it to my friend Liam O'Leary, who was a great encourager, worked at the National Film Archive. And by one of those incredible coincidences, shortly after I showed him the photograph, he looked through the glass door of his office and he saw that same man standing at the British Film Institute's headquarters in Shaftesbury Avenue. Turned out that Gans had come over to see Cinerama, had walked down the road after the show, and had been attracted by a sign saying British Film Institute, and walked in. And Liam saw him and went out, and in his execrable French, Irish accented French, he said, "Êtes-vous Monsieur Gans?" And he was amazed to be recognized. And Liam reported this to, I suppose it was James Quinn in those days. What can that be?
It's his mobile.
What's it got on? I know, but what's it got on it?
I don't know.
It sounds like a soundtrack.
I don't know. Forgot to switch it off, didn't he?
What's the ringtone?
It's some awful thing my son has put on, which I can't.
Oh, I see.
I don't know the technology to get rid of it. Sorry about that.
So Liam approached the...
James Quinn you mentioned.
Was it? Must have been. Not Dennis Foreman. Anyway, Liam went to the director of the British Film Institute, and it was suggested that a small reception be held, to which he invited me. Now, I was at school. He had to ring my mother.
What have you been?
No, by this time it was 1954. So I must have been 15. The only reason for a telephone call that in those days was if a member of the family had died. So nobody questioned the fact that I had to leave. I was in a mock exam for a school certificate in German, I think it was, and ironically, and my mother said, Abel Gance is at the National Film Theatre. Liam says, get down there as soon as you can. So I grabbed my script. The script of Napoleon was published in 1927, and I'd got a copy of it. It was still available. So few people had bought it. And a couple of stills, and I rushed down to the NFT, and I met this extraordinary man who was going to have such an effect on my life. He was dramatically handsome and looked like a medieval saint with his hair swept back and a half smile on his face. He was incredibly charming. He was just what you'd hoped he'd be. Trouble is, he didn't speak English. So my schoolboy French wasn't nearly good enough. But somehow we got through. I must have had an interpreter. One of the people there must have interpreted for him. And some of the other people were Carol Rice, who was not yet famous. He was still working for the BFI. Michael Balkan, Basil Wright, people who had heard of Gance but probably didn't know, probably hadn't seen anything by him. So they didn't occupy his time like I did. And I remember at the end he was talking about his Polyvision, which was an improvement on his triptych, as a rival to Cinerama. And as he came out, he said, keep your eyes straight ahead. He said, non, les yeux Polyvision. So that was my first meeting with anybody from the silent era.
Was he still working then, Gance, or had he retired?
Yes, he was still working.
That's amazing.
But actually there was another one, now I come to think of it. That little Douglas Fairbanks film had an extraordinary tale attached to it. When I was working in documentaries, I kept hearing people talk about the Al Parker Agency, which was where you got actors from. And having a one-track mind and knowing the cast of my little Douglas Fairbanks film, I remembered the villain was played by Albert S. Parker. So I felt this had a good chance of being the same person. So I rang him up, and he had a reassuring American accent. And I said, sorry to bother you, but does the name Douglas Fairbanks mean anything? He said, Doug, Jesus Christ, I directed him. I said, oh, what did you direct? He said, The Black Pirate. Most embarrassing not to have known that. Anyway, I told him I had this film, and he said, bring it over. And I set the machine up in his office, which was incidentally, the walls were lined with Black Pirate stills, which I eventually inherited. And his wife was Margaret Johnston, the actress. She was fascinated to see Al when he was in his youth, because he was quite old then, and organized a dinner for the clientele, such as James Mason, Trevor Howard, Clive Brook, Hardy Kruger.
You were in.
So I was really in. And Parker used to tell me when silent film people were passing through town, like King Vidor staying at the Hyde Park Hotel. And he introduced me to Douglas Fairbanks Jr., so that little film really served me very well.
Clarence Brown, you met him through Al Parker as well, didn't you? You didn't.
Well, that was another phase. I met an American collector called John Parrish, and he showed me, he was staying in Paddington, and he used to bring a projector with him all the way from, I suppose he was on a liner, but he produced projectors and films he brought over from America. And he ran me his print of Mark of Zorro. And he then said, you really ought to switch to 16mm. I said, oh, I can't afford it. 15 shillings a reel was the most I could possibly go for Napoleon. He said, no, you've got to do it. Look, here's the covered wagon. I'll sell you the covered wagon for £2 a reel. I said, £2 a reel? But you'll never regret it. And my God, I didn't. I did buy it. I took it home and ran it. It was the most stunning quality, right off the camera negative. And the film was marvellous. I don't know why it's so derided nowadays. I think it's absolutely superb.
It was one of the first phono films, actually. It was a coloured reel of the covered wagon. 1923 they did that. I think, my memory's still right.
A sound.
Yeah, they put a soundtrack on it, a musical soundtrack on it.
Yes, you're quite right.
It was colour.
Was it?
I thought did they not do Technicolor reel of it?
No.
Right.
But it did have a musical accompaniment, and funnily enough, Al Parker told me that, and I couldn't believe him. 1923, he's got it wrong. Anyway, the covered wagon led to, of course, I then went to completely bananas about acquiring amber Kodascope library prints, which were these superb quality tinted prints. You couldn't get closer to the originals short of having a 35mm projector. So I then got offered from Watso Films of Coventry a film called The Goose Woman. Oh, a dreadful title, that can't be any good. But then it said, with Constance Bennett, Jack Pickford, Louise Dresser, and who else was in it? Someone else was in it, very important. So I gave it a go. Another £2 a reel job. And when it arrived and I projected it, it was so outstanding that I remember thinking, if there are any more American silent films like this, I'll happily spend the rest of my life looking for them, which is precisely what's happened. It was so good that I did what I did with Napoleon, and then hunted down every Clarence Brown film I could find. And who should get the next one but John Huntley at the British Film Institute? And I realized it would go into the National Film Archive and we'd never see it. So I threw myself on Huntley's mercy and I said, please, 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 let me buy this from you. He said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll make a copy for the distribution library and then you can exchange it. So I found everything I think of that he might want. And he very generously let me have it. And that was Smouldering Fires with Pauline Frederick, which was even, well, almost better than The Goose Woman. It's a brilliant film about a woman who runs a factory. So I then had to find out, was Clarence Brown alive? And I wrote a letter to the Directors Guild, the care of the Directors Guild, but never got an answer. And one day I got a telephone call from a theatre critic on the New York Herald Tribune in Paris. Would I come and see him? And he said, listen, you've got The Goose Woman, haven't you? I said, how did you know that? He said, my closest friend is Clarence Brown. He's over in Paris for the motor show. And he wants me to find out if you've really got The Goose Woman. So I said, okay, I'll show it to you. Brought the projector over, did the usual thing. And he was very impressed with it. And he passed word that I was now permitted to meet Clarence Brown. So I took the projector over to the Georges Cinq Hotel in Paris to discover it didn't work on French voltage. Most embarrassing. So we had to go to the Cinematheque. I rang up.
Langlois then?
And I had met Langlois. No, I don't think I had. But anyway, it was probably because I hadn't that he agreed. He agreed to let me have the film projected in the Cinematheque. But the theatre, I think it was Roger Vadim was in there. And he kept us waiting for ages. When he emerged, I introduced him to Clarence Brown, who after all had made 7 Garbo films. And Vadim didn't express any interest whatsoever. Anyway, what was remarkable was Langlois. I don't think he was there, but he had said, there's another film. And we saw a print off the camera negative on 35 of Last of the Mohicans.
Maurice Tournier.
Yeah, he fell off a parallel, apparently, according to Brown, and Brown directed it. So that was extremely exciting. And then I went back to the hotel with him, and he didn't want me to tape record him. So I thought, this is too good a chance to miss. I lugged the tape recorder everywhere I went anyway, and I just switched it on and held the microphone underneath the table and managed to get the interview with Clarence Brown.
You still got that?
Still got that. And I've got a lot more Clarence Brown films, which I'm trying to find sponsorship to bring out on DVD, because he is the great lost name. You know, you hear of Hawks and Ford and all the rest, but Clarence Brown nobody knows.
No, because the name sounds a little bit sort of mid-Western or mid-American and sort of banal, but in fact, you know, and he was a very great filmmaker.
He really was, absolutely.
You mentioned in the last few minutes the names of Liam O'Leary and
Burgoyne Johnson, that's even more, and Burt Langdon is even more important.
And Burt Langdon. But before we go on to Burt Langdon, I wanted to ask you a little bit about Liam and John Huntley and Ernest Lindgren. And what I know, and what do you think about how in Britain we compared to in France, we looked at film and own film, because Liam obviously was very pro silent film. I met Liam, and he was very fond of Stukin, and he was passionate about film, and Huntley was in his own way, whereas Lindgren wasn't, or was he? Did you meet Lindgren as well?
My experience with Lindgren was always unfortunate. One has to acknowledge that if he had not been so puritanical in his attitude to collectors, the industry wouldn't have trusted him, and he wouldn't have got many of the films that he preserved.
But he employed good people.
But because I was a collector, he actually said to Liam, "There goes a man who represents everything I despise."
That you?
Yes. I always thought he was straight out of the Protectorate. I always thought he would be a perfect Cromwellian general. I had an encounter with Raymond Rohauer, and he said, "Go to Ernest Lindgren. I have the other film with Eleonora Duse, not Cenere, which I think they both had, but another one called Agnes Visconti, and I will exchange it with him for a particular title which I forget." And when I brought this up in Lindgren's office, he virtually threw me out. He was furious. And of course he didn't get the other Eleonora Duse film. And I think he lost an enormous amount of films for outraging private collectors. I still know one who won't have anything to do with the BFI because of the way he was treated by the archive during the Lindgren era. But, as you say, he employed good people. He employed Liam O'Leary, who couldn't have been better for all of us, because he had exactly the opposite attitude, and he rescued all sorts of films from all sorts of amazing places. And he would call me in to see them. I mean, can you imagine anything better? I remember seeing Suspense for the first time, this extraordinary one-reel Lois Weber picture with split screen and amazing overhead shots. I remember seeing an original print of Carmen by Feder. He was marvellous that way. And he had started on 9.5, as had I, in the same way in Ireland. I was always hoping he'd bring his collection over and give it to me, but it never happened. But he was also so knowledgeable too. And he went after the people. He would go to France and interview Jean Forest, the little boy in Visage d'Enfant and Gribiche, and he was a friend of several of the old actresses that played in serials and in the very early years. He was so knowledgeable. It set a mark. And then when he started Rex Ingram book, that proved to be, if he hadn't done that, again, all those interviews would have been lost. But sorry.
No, I was thinking, you also mentioned Burt Langdon and you mentioned Raymond Rohauer, two contrasting characters. Can you talk about those two people?
Not in the same breath. Burt Langdon was one of the most extraordinary characters I met at this period. I'd heard that somebody was giving film shows in Camden Town on a Saturday night using original 35mm nitrate prints. And I couldn't wait to find out what they looked like, because my objection to the activities at the British Film Institute were largely based on going to see great classics of the silent screen and emerging 90 minutes later having not seen them because the prints were so bad they were invisible. They couldn't tell Emil Jannings from Tom Mix. So here was the real thing. Now the drawback was nitrate being extremely inflammable and Burt Langdon being sensible. He didn't have a very bright light in his projector. Nonetheless, the prints glistened and gleamed compared to what you saw most of the time at the BFI. And you saw the average American commercial release as opposed to the art films, which is what you mostly saw at the NFT. Burt Langdon himself was like a leprechaun, and he had a very turned-up nose. He was very small, and a broad Cockney accent, talk like this, rather like more Merriest. But he was so generous and so kind and so knowledgeable. It was like going to a university. He would sometimes, he had 86,000 feet, I remember, of bits. These were the rolls of film that he bought in markets for sixpence and joined them all up. And he found out what every single one of them was. That really knocked me flat.
It's like Grant Lobham, who you may not know. Grant Lobham's got in his house millions of frames.
Oh.
Hundreds of thousands of frames. He knows what everyone is.
Good God. Well, what he used to do was test you on them. Say, all right, Kevin, who's that? And I'd say, Norma Talmadge? No. And you'd have several more goes, and then he'd tell you that it was Mildred Harris. And it was fascinating to learn like this because the footage was so amazing. My God, you saw extracts from lost films that will never be seen. You know, the wonderful stuff. And then he would show complete features. He would show Mary Pickford in The Hoodlum. And I remember Mary Pickford in The Hoodlum extremely well because it was so superbly photographed, staged, and directed in 1919 that I sat down and wrote a fan letter to the cameraman. And I wrote to him, care of the American Society of Cinematographers, never expecting an answer, and I didn't get one, which is fair enough. But I got a telephone call, and the English voice said, "This is Charles Rocher. I'm at the St. Dermans Hotel. Why don't you come over?" And for a moment I thought, who's Charles Rocher? Anyway, he was one of those characters who you didn't have to tell him how marvellous he was. He told you, which I found rather strange, you know. It's very unusual you find someone who is so gifted, he's a genius at the camera, and yet needed to tell you that.
British. Wasn't he British?
And he was British, yes. Came from Kent, I think. Anyway, what amazed me was, here was Burt Langdon, a working class bloke from a piano factory in Camden Town, living in, you know, the sort of conditions you'd expect. Charles Rocher insisted, who came from Hollywood, the utter luxury of it you wouldn't believe, insisted on going the next Saturday to Burt Langdon's, where he charmed them all, and Burt talked Mary Pickford, his favourite actress, entire evening, showed him The Hoodlum, and then brought out My Best Girl, his favourite picture. And Rocher was thrilled to see these things, albeit on this low wattage bulb. They still look magnificent. And that was the beginning of a long friendship with Charles Rocher.
Do you talk about Eleanor Glyn as well? Because he worked with her, didn't he?
He never mentioned Eleanor Glyn until he died, and I picked up some of the things he left me, including the Academy Award for Sunrise. And there was a huge signed picture of Eleanor Glyn in Knowing Men, which turned out to be one of the worst films I've ever seen in my life. But beautifully photographed.
There's a lot of prints of it around.
Yeah, I know, that's always the way with lousy films. They're in terrible. The lousy ones are in perfect condition.
That was supposed to be multilingual and in colour.
Yes.
I don't think it ever was multilingual, and I don't think it ever was in colour.
I think it was in colour because the print in black and white that I saw had that grey, bland look that prints from colour have. I think they never printed it in colour. And it's very sad that, you know, Rocher ended up doing that sort of thing. Still, he went back to Hollywood, but he had a rather fallow period over here, doing Betty Balfour films and Atlantic.
Before I go on to your early career, I asked you that one question about your relationship with Mr. Raymond Rohauer, because I remember once reading an article in a magazine about film, which I think you were involved in editing, where you wrote a whole page about copyright and Raymond Rohauer. I don't know if you remember this.
Well, Raymond Rohauer was a name to cause your blood to run cold in those early days. He used to find out who had films he laid claim to and make sure they withdrew them. And the British Film Institute lay down under this. I met him in 1960, and he told me that he was searching for British silent films. And we had dinner, I remember, and he told me that he just met King Vidor and Lewis Milestone. He mentioned a lot of names. I said, "Oh, King Vidor's just been through here, the Hyde Park Hotel." And he said, "Name dropper." He was a most unattractive character, completely without charm, and always accompanied by a very strange elderly individual wearing 2 pairs of glasses. I never quite understand this. However, he offered me, if I would work with him, he offered to pay me in films. And the films he offered to pay me were Queen Kelly, Greed, Underworld, Last Command, you know, all the films one dreamt of owning. So I most enthusiastically went along with his requests, which were first of all perfectly straightforward. He wanted British silent features, and we got a lot of them in. And then he started asking me to go across the alleyway, which was about literally 3 feet, and get him some Chaplin two-reelers from little Equity British distributors. Well, I did that once or twice, but I couldn't think why he wasn't doing it, since they were for him. But I suppose he was already getting a reputation among distributors, and I was an innocent face. Anyhow, I began to think something was rather odd when the main body of the company arrived from America and included a fellow called J. Ward. No, it was Bill Scott. This was J. Ward Productions they all worked for. And Bill Scott told me about Raymond Rohauer and what they were actually doing. And what they were actually doing was fractured flickers, in which they would make these films look ridiculous. And as soon as I heard that, I withdrew, and mercifully, they never did the series, although we got through an awful lot of footage. And did he pay me in film? Yes. An enormous box arrived, care of John Huntley, of all people, with a stupendous amount of customs duty on it. And they were the sweepings of his collection, all the junk he wanted to get rid of. There were about three or four worthwhile titles, and the rest, which I replaced with blank spacing, gash spacing, and sent back, so I didn't have to pay the customs duty. And then I began to find out more and more about Rohauer and getting more and more angry. But when we started the Hollywood series years later, I said that we would use everybody but Rohauer. And my partner, David Gill, said, I think you're making a mistake. And he made it his job to meet this fellow once a month. And he got the most extraordinary things out of him. Because he was clean, he wasn't a collector. And it ended up with us getting that huge Chaplin haul, all the outtakes from the Mutuals, which was entirely David's doing. And in the end, Rohauer turned out to be a great asset. I can't believe I'm saying this. Although Chaplin's business manager, Rachel Ford, said, I don't want to hear the names Chaplin and Rohauer without a V between them.
Mentioning names, while we're just on names, did you ever meet Everson while he was in Britain?
Oh, I knew Everson very well. And when I went to America for the first time in 1964, he offered to show me whatever I wanted to see way into the early hours of the morning. He would set up the projector and just keep feeding it. And so I would meet the people that I was going to interview during the day and then watch their films at night and then go home at 2 or 3 in the morning. It's an extraordinary experience. He was tremendously generous and knowledgeable, but funnily enough, it was his program notes that used to excite me about some of the films. In fact, he turned me on to Maurice Tourneur through his program note, not through the film. When I finally bought the film, the program note was much better. However, he did remain a special pet of mine, if only because he trained Clarence Brown. No, he also couldn't stand the academic language which was creeping into film teaching.
Neither can you.
And I can't bear it either. It's
Is that because you didn't go to university, or did you?
I didn't go to university. Do you think that would have made a difference?
Yes, if you become an academic, it would.
No, I could never become an academic, but I do think plain English is essential in many realms, not just film.
Did you pass your matric?
We had school certificate in those days. And I remember going to my first job, and the accountant, the financial director, said, how many O-levels you got? So I told him, and he said, I just tell you one thing, there'll be no bloody use to you here. how right he was.
So, and what age were you then? 14 or later?
No, I was 17 when I went into the film industry as an office boy. And the other office boy became a multi-millionaire manager of The Who and the author of a book called Black Vinyl and White Powder.
And what's his name?
Things I missed out on. Sam Napier Bell. He was the son of... No, Simon Napier Bell. He was the son of Sam Napier Bell, who was a documentary director.
Right. What about National Service? Was that around when you were...
Oh, God, yes, that's another great strand in all this. I was completely besotted with the Navy, almost certainly because I had been to see Morning Departure and Cruel Sea and all those things, and liked the uniform. And I actually formed a naval training unit. When I was a kid, talk of hue and cry, we had nothing but bomb buildings from where we were all the way along Finchley Road from Swiss Cottage to St John's Wood, which must be a couple of miles, and very, very, very long gardens, all of which were overgrown. So we had an adventure playground of miles and miles and miles. And I started this naval training unit, which was really an excuse to shoot at each other and throw mortar bombs at each other and behave like the characters in Hue and Cry, but with a degree of respectability. And then I discovered that my eyes were no good for the Navy, and that was awful. I wasn't going to get into the Navy. But
what's wrong with your eyes?
Short sight, severe short sight. So for the Navy, that was no good. And then they got me up for the Army and decided I wasn't much good for that either. And so I gained a precious 2 years that my comrades were condemned to.
Peeling potatoes.
Yeah. Although I met some young men who were taught Russian, that would have been sensational, except I'm a terrible linguist, but that would have been useful.
So in those 2 years you graduated from an office boy working to become an editor?
Yes, yes.
Tell us about how that happened.
I was... you remember that film, that French film I made? I can't believe that I made a French film in Hampstead, but anyway, I did. One of the young men that played a German soldier in that was offered promotion from the office boy if he could find a replacement office boy. So he decided I was the one. And I only lasted 5 days as an office boy before they put me in the cutting rooms as a trainee assistant editor. I found a very different world than I expected, and they were not interested in films. I couldn't believe it. These people working in the cinema, most of them were not interested in films. And when I said, "Did you see such a film?" they would make comments such as, "I got enough to do with films during the day. I don't want to go and see them at night," which I simply could not understand. But then I met an editor called Ken Morgan, who was a very different fellow, took me under his wing, taught me the basis of editing, and was very sympathetic. And then I met John Krish, who was a brilliant documentary director and has remained a very close friend to this day. In fact, I'd be having lunch with him if it wasn't for doing this. He was the one who made that film about the last London tram, The Elephant Will Never Forget.
Yes. What was the French film you said you made in Hampstead?
This thing about the war.
Is that linked to the German film you made?
Yeah, that one. The one about the Germans in France, the French occupation, German occupation. Anyway, that was called The Capture.
I've never seen that.
No, nobody's seen that. That's the one I put in.
How many other films did you make then that we don't know about?
Not many. But that's the one I put in the wardrobe and got rid of, if you recall. Worldwide Pictures was the company I worked for, and I became an editor in 1958. Again, John Krish took me through that in the evenings, teaching me the art of editing. And then I was an editor for documentary after documentary after documentary. And we moved to Cursitor Street in the city, just off Chancery Lane. And I suddenly, I'd been in touch with him before, he'd been in touch with me, a young man called Peter Watkins, who was also making films on 8mm at this stage. And he applied for a job at Worldwide and became my assistant. So that was just like a university, because we used to have terrific arguments about filmmaking, and then all the other young editors and assistants would join in, and Peter would go off and make a film a year in his holidays. But he also helped a lot on It Happened Here. He even did the makeup.
I was going to ask you, when did that start? At around which time did it start?
It Happened Here, 1956.
And were you working editing then when it started?
I was an office boy when I got the idea for that picture. All I had to do was take film cans to the laboratory and back. And I was walking up Charlotte Street to Humphreys Labs, and a Citroën screeched to a halt beside me, and the fellow jumped out, ran into a delicatessen, and yelled back at the driver in German. And I thought, my God, I wonder what it would have been like if we'd lost and been occupied. And I began thinking about this as I walked around London, and it slowly developed. And I remember my mother saying, well, it's all very well, but you've got to do things like Nazi rallies in Trafalgar Square. How are you going to do that? And being someone of very little imagination, I just thought, well, I'll do it. And so I did it. And it was simply terrible. Even I could see that. And so I redid it. It was a sort of film you reshot in order to put on the shelf.
This is all in 16mm?
This is in 16mm. It was costing money. But I was earning £4.10 a week, so I thought I could pay for it. And there had to be very long gaps before I could afford another roll of film.
What about Andrew Mollo? Had you met him by then?
No, I never heard of him until 1957, I think. I went down to Portobello Road because somebody told me they were selling German uniform. And I bought a German steel helmet and asked the fellow if he knew of other collectors. And he said, there's one. And he was very oddly dressed. He designed a suit for himself, which was very Victorian. And he looked a bit odd. I thought, art student. That's all I need, because art students don't get paid either, do they? But he invited me to his place to see his collection. And as soon as I saw his collection, I realized I had to have him, because I wasn't going to get one without the other. How can I get hold of him? Keep him on, but I know, I'll make him art director. So he then wanted to see what had been shot. And I remember taking him home and drawing the curtains and putting the projector up and showing this stuff with great pride. And at the end he said, the trouble with every single thing in that is incorrect. And I got furious. I mean, he was 16 and I was 18. How could he dare say such a thing? And I said, well, can't argue about that officer's uniform. He said, no, that's an American Air Force uniform, adapted, and it looks like it. It's dreadful. So we tried one session with everything being authentic, and the difference was so amazing. I just threw all that stuff away and started again. And he taught me the importance of authenticity when you're recreating a period, something I'd never thought about. I thought, like, yes, as in the theatre, you get something that looks vaguely like it. And that's what you got from costumiers. You never got anything original. You got stuff that had been adapted. But, my God, what a difference.
What were your links with the British Film Institute, did you get any grant from the... Because they did produce films then, didn't they?
There was an experimental film fund much later on, but they turned us down. Not experimental enough.
So how long did it take you to make this film? How did you get hold of the actors for it?
It took 8 years to make the picture from conception to final cut. And the actors were constantly being signed and then leaving because it went on so long and it was clearly so amateur before Andrew came on it. And then it became more professional, and he had a great deal to say about the look of the people in it, and taught me, again, another university course, observation. He would always notice things that nobody else had seen. I remember on a later film driving around looking for locations, and suddenly the car would screech to a halt, and he'd noticed through a hole in the hedge spokes of a wheel, and he put the rest of the vehicle together, and he knew there was an old farm cart there which we needed for the film. He was amazing. We had a Mercedes-Benz German Army staff car in the picture. He'd noticed it in Notting Hill Gate, and it belonged to some West Indians, and he hadn't done anything about getting hold of it, and it was the night before we shot. He said, "Oh, all right then, so we drove over, and there was just a patch where it had been. It was a wet day, and you just saw a dry patch where the vehicle had been. My immediate reaction was, no good, we've lost it, disaster. His reaction was, that proves it moves." Terrific to work with a guy like that, I can tell you. Optimism. And persistence, wow. Absolutely. I delayed writing a script for the film, mainly because I didn't know how to write scripts, and also because once I'd written the script, it would cease to be the greatest film ever made. At this point, I was going to be the second Orson Welles, and I was going to top Citizen Kane with this picture. But every time I shot anything, it somehow didn't look quite like Citizen Kane, so I kept it quiet, and I kept the script under cover because there wasn't one. And then I needed a leading lady, and I couldn't find one of those. But everything fell into place when Derek Hill, another important figure in my youth, the film critic, came up to me at a film show, at a film society show, and said, "Did you meet Mrs. Jobson?" "No." "Who's that?" "Well, I think she'd be very good for your film." And this film society was giving an award to her husband, who was a doctor, but was also an amateur filmmaker. And she'd come along too, and she looked dead right for the film. And that turned out to be Dick Jobson, and he invited me up to Wales, where his practice was. And sure enough, she was spot on for the film and accepted it, and had to come down to London every time we had a session. God. On one occasion, somebody drove her. She was late. Somebody drove her to the station, and she jumped into a crowded carriage and yelled back, "Oh, I've forgotten my gas mask." Anyway, that picture went on and on and on. It was a nightmare in many respects. But
you filmed it and edited it all yourself, did you?
Yes, we did everything ourselves except processing. Yeah, I photographed it for the first few years, and then when we went out, we had to go to. Andrew Mollo became an assistant director at Woodfall Films, and he said he wasn't going to mention the film to Tony Richardson because so many people tried to get money out of him. But eventually he did, and Richardson said, "Well, if you can," he looked at what we'd shot and said, "If you can finish this film for £3,000, I'll give you the money." Well, we only went 100% over budget, but we got the money, and thanks to him, and managed to. But he said, "You have to finish it on 35, prove that the 16mm can be blown up," which we had to do, and luckily Kays did a good optical job. and we were able to finish the film in 35, and we thought that that was the ideal calling card for the industry and that we'd be hired as professional directors, but it never happened.
What happened?
What happened was we made a great error going too far with this authenticity lark, and we started, you asked how we got the actors. Well, we decided to use real Nazis, and we had a sequence in which they would just let rip on their beliefs, and that so outraged everybody. We got the reputation for being Nazis ourselves.
You're talking about the fascist group that still exists. So that had a negative effect on the promotion of the film, distribution of the film?
Well, let me tell you how it happened. Andrew was contacted by somebody who said, could he borrow a swastika flag for a party? And I said, what sort of party wants a swastika flag? He said, well, we're invited, let's go and find out. So we went to Onslow Gardens, and gradually the guests arrived. They all had badges of a certain type in their lapel. Sometimes lightning flash of the British Union of Fascists, now called the Union Movement, or then called the Union Movement. Some were Hungarian with the Arrow organization, which was a Nazi organization. And when I realized what was going on, I went up to the host, whose name was Frank Bennett, and who eventually played a prominent role in the film. And I said, I've always wanted to ask someone like you, how do you justify the camps? He says, what do you mean justify? He said, the Jews were our enemy. They were interned, just like we interned enemies on the Isle of Man. But they're a filthy race. Disease spread through the camp. Suddenly you've got thousands of people with disease. You can't let them loose on the population. So you exterminate them. It's the kindest thing to do. And I was so staggered, and I realized no one could sit down and write that sort of dialogue. The only way to capture it was just to turn the camera on them. And naturally one couldn't use that particular phrase because it didn't fit the story. But we got some pretty chilling comments. And I thought that tells you more about fascism than anything, because up till now there had not been a single film that told you what fascism was. Nor had we been told what we were at war for. The war aims were never published. So this was a film which tried to make up for that.
Did you consider yourself part of the free cinema movement? You mentioned Tony Richardson and letting this type of shot take its own course.
No.
So you hadn't met Lindsay Anderson by...
Oh yeah, Lindsay Anderson.
Sorry.
The first person who ever encouraged me in filmmaking was Lindsay Anderson. He came to see my film, The Capture, and commented on it. He complimented me on it. And that, coming from a professional film director, was staggering. I should add that he never encouraged me again, and I worked with him on many projects. But I was very fond of him, and he was working at Worldwide when I first joined them. He'd won an Oscar for Thursday's Children. Incidentally, Worldwide's office still has a picture of an Oscar in the window in the office on the wall as a result of Thursday's Children nearly 60 years ago. However, Lindsay went on to become the narrator on some of our films when James Mason died. And we used to have the most... I edited for him when he was at Woodfall, a film called The White Bus. And we used to have terrific arguments, such a degree. There was an Italian restaurant opposite my cutting room in Soho. And I remember Lindsay finally left after this uproar. And waiter came up to me and said, "Kevin, you mean that's a friend of yours?"
Yes, she didn't compromise, did Lindsay? I don't think. I used to sit next to him at the NFT during the John Ford season.
Oh, yeah.
I never spoke to him,
Oh.
unfortunately. But so that's before he wrote the book on Ford. But you talked about editing. What were the early editing suites like that you worked in? Or were they called suites then?
No, God no. Cutting rooms. They were very prosaic, with a black moviola. Sometimes they had a thing called a editola, which is one of the most incompetent machines ever invented for the cinema, which was wall mounted and a bullseye lens. You couldn't see the picture. Hopeless. But the moviola was a good machine and very tough, and you had the rewind bench and masses of cans on shelves, and that was about it. Chinograph pencils and ghastly smelling film cement until the arrival of tape, which was a godsend. But sellotape wasn't around then. You had butterfly tape, which wasn't strong enough.
What film do you remember working on?
Well, just let me finish this.
Right.
Then they brought out a thing called the robot joiner, and this machine was extremely heavy, and it was designed to cut the film, scrape it, and apply the cement and the pressure all in 3 or 4 movements. Now, the robot was incredibly expensive, and as I say, it was extremely heavy, and imagine me carrying the robot. I could only just about hold it, walking into the next cutting room, and I kicked the door open because it was on a swing, and somebody had piled cans up behind it. So it bounced off the can, hit me, and I dropped the robot. Now, in those days, it cost £75 to repair it. Imagine how much that would be 50 years later. And it created this hole in the floor. It might have been my foot. Nobody thought of that. But I was in disgrace, can you imagine? And never forget that. Also, the first time anybody asked me to do anything, I worked for an editor who had a speech impediment, a frightful stammer. So he didn't say anything to me all day long. He just carried on cutting. And at the end, his trim bin was absolutely jammed solid. And as he walked out about 6:30, he just said, "File those trims." So I sat there thinking, I wonder what he means. He'd pointed towards all those bits of film. Maybe he wants me to do something with them, but I can't imagine what. But anyway, I better do something. So I picked every one individually, wrapped it up in a little roll, and put a rubber band, and created this gigantic pyramid. And when he came in next morning, he was appalled. He then said nothing to me, carried on editing, and he had a reel full of, instead of using the joiner, he just put paper clips. And as he left at 6:30, he turned to me and said, "Join that reel." I wonder what he means. I knew what splicing was, and joining must be related to it. So here goes. And I went through and joined every single one out of rack. A 35mm has 4 sprocket holes, and of course I chose the wrong set to join, and when he took it to screen it, every time there was a join, you got the frame line across the picture area. Oh. At this point I heard him complaining about me to the supervising editor in the coffee room next door, and I realized my mistakes, but he never explained.
You didn't get the sack then?
No, I didn't get the sack, nor did I get the sack when I staged a scene for It Happened Here on the roof, left the door open at night, and there was a violent storm, and the water poured down the stairs through the ceiling of the film library that was occupying the floor beneath us. And the woman who ran that tried to get me the sack, but nobody was interested at that point. Oh, awful.
What film did you work on? Do you remember any titles at all?
Foothold on Antarctica. I remember that because I did my first assembly work on that. That was a film which was shot by the explorers themselves. It was hit in 1958.
Hillary, was it? Or
what?
Wasn't Hillary? Who?
Yeah, Edmund Hillary was on it. George Lowe, who'd shot the Everest expedition, and he shot this. They were all given Bell and Howell auto-load cameras with cassettes. You didn't have to thread them. You just put the cassette in and close the door. But what they didn't realise was that the men had woolen gloves, and every time they put the cassette in, they added to the little display of wool around the aperture. So we used to get the rushes, and you'd have what looked like a blackberry bush on one side and a willow tree on the other. And all this had to be optically enlarged to get rid of it. And we had to log the DA, dirty aperture. We had to log as blackberry bush, willow tree, and Vivian Fuchs was the strangest one because he'd obviously been brought up with box cameras as a child, because when he was on the ship going out there, the Magadan, he looked through his viewfinder and it was the wrong ratio for the ship. So he shot everything like this. And at rushes, everyone was... Anyway, that was very unfortunate.
Did you always work in commercial concerns as an editor, or did you try to work for the BBC, or think of that?
No, who was that chap who ran Monitor?
Hugh Weldon.
Hugh Weldon said of me, Kevin Brownlow is the least organisation-minded person I've ever met. But the unfair thing was he never met me.
Really? Why did he say that then?
I don't know. But he was right. I wouldn't have flourished at the BBC any more than I did at Worldwide.
You never applied then?
I did make a film for the BBC in the 60s, my first documentary on filmmaking about Abel Gance, called The Charm of Dynamite.
Does that survive?
But that wasn't made for the organisation. It was made and then given to them as a finished job. Yes, I've got that. Yes, I've got that.
Did you interview Gantz in that?
Yes. And my cameraman was Chris Menges.
Oh, right.
And I interviewed Dieudonné as well.
You mentioned you didn't have a television as a child, is that correct? So your first... is that correct?
The first time I ever saw television was at my cousin's, which was at the corner of this road, funnily enough, and now demolished. And it was Western Approaches, Pat Jackson, who I've got to know very well since. Pat Jackson made a fantastic film of Western Approaches, but you wouldn't have appreciated it on television because he shot it in Technicolor, and of course television was blue and white and it had a large magnifier in front of this tiny screen, but it was still a great thrill. But I never really took any notice of television until John Krish began inviting me to see Play of the Day and outstanding things like that. That was that made an impact. But what really did it was The World at War. And I was still too snobbish to have a television set, so I used to go to a friend. We were making Winstanley, and this friend was Ian Seller and his wife Linda. And Linda, being a true pacifist, refused to look at it and lay on the sofa with her back to the television set. And there were 26 of these. I don't know how she stood us coming round each time. And then they repeated them, and when they repeated them I hadn't the nerve to say, can I come back and see them all over again? So I bought a television set. And I was so impressed with this series that I wrote a fan letter to Jeremy Isaacs, who produced them. And he wrote back and said, this is a surprising coincidence because I'm giving your book, The Parade's Gone By, to all the crew as a present for the end of production. I think there's a television series in it. Come and discuss it. So I went to Jeremy Isaacs and at Thames Television, and all I remember is he said, this is a very ulcer-producing activity. And when I got on the pavement outside the building, I collapsed. I was in great pain, just as though I had an ulcer. I thought, this is a bit quick, I haven't agreed yet. I managed to get home, and my wife thought I was acting. It took a long time before I was in the ambulance with sirens screaming, rushing to hospital, and I had appendicitis. I was against the idea of doing it because I thought still that television would wreck it, and it was going to be like an alcoholic's cure. But Virginia said, do it. So we'll try. And they said, do you want to produce it yourself or do you want to have a partner? Oh, I said, a producer. I said, I'll have a producer, please. And then I wondered, God, who am I going to get? The previous time I'd met a producer, he'd said to me, I just want to let you know I can't stand silent films. But luckily he got sacked for other reasons. And they gave me somebody called David Gill. Now, my father, the artist, admired above all others in England a chap called Eric Gill. And this was his nephew. So that was an incredible coincidence. Furthermore, during the end of the war at school, he'd been in charge of the music for the silent films, putting on the gramophone records and the projection and everything. So he'd had that background. And it had lain fallow while he'd been number 1 a ballet dancer, number 2 a film editor, and number 3 a television director. But it all came back as, in fact, he was more, there's a word I've forgotten. Anyway, I'll come back to it. He proved to be the ideal man for the job because he knew the politics as well as everything else. Never would he give up. And he was like a barrister. Once he had you in the dock, so to speak, you wouldn't get out till you agreed to do what he wanted you to do. That was priceless. But also he needed a long runway to get going, so it took longer than necessary, longer than it would normally, but it paid off in the end.
And that's how you also invented the World of War. That was Carl Davis's music, wasn't it?
That's right, and we got Carl Davis.
That's where you first came across him.
Yes.
And that was a long relationship which led up to Napoleon.
Yeah,
for that.
And he just did The Godless Girl for us. That was an amazing theme for the World of War. I never thought that we'd get such a composer. He went to America and interviewed the last surviving musicians from that period too. I don't know anybody who captures that period as well as Carl Davis. And every time I see, we just went to Los Angeles to present 2 of our Fairbanks restorations, and to hear the music that he did for those 2 was really thrilling.
You mentioned Winstanley, and there's a gap between doing Winstanley and it happened here. I don't know how long the gap is between the 2. Were there other projects in between or not?
Well, when It Happened Here finished, we really did think we were going to be given a professional feature to make. And it was a matter of getting an agent, looking at scripts, going through all that nonsense. And it was nonsense because we never got anything except the offer of second unit on the Viking Queen. So we decided to make another film ourselves, and we had an agent who gave it to Michael Winner, who sold it to Universal Pictures. It never got made. We were hired by Brian Forbes at ABPC to make a picture with 2 producers on it. We discovered that one of the producers was double-crossing us, and when we pointed this out, we were fired before a frame was shot. So we had a run of bad luck, which may have been our own fault, but we did not end up making pictures. Of course, 2 blokes wanting to direct is fatal. There have not been very many of those around. I mean, even Powell and Pressburger weren't both directors. You've got Cooper and Scherdzak, I suppose, but that wasn't a sensible idea. Lorne and Gilliatt, they weren't really. One was the writer. One was more of a writer.
The brothers sometimes switched, actually. But what were the projects that you didn't make then? Those 2 or 3 projects.
There was one on Reinhard Heydrich, which was very exciting because.
Was he? Sorry.
Oh.
The Second World War.
In the Second World War, Czechoslovakia was run by Reinhard Heydrich, the protector of Bohemia and Moravia, and the British decided to assassinate him, and the operation was marred by the most appalling bad luck and incompetence, and it led to the Lidice being wiped out, and Humphrey Jennings' film Silent Village. Yeah. And anyway, we wanted to make that picture, and almost did. It had to be made on location in Prague, of course, and just as we were making contact with Barrandov Studios, the Russians invaded. But it was very exciting because we managed to wheedle a trip to Prague, among the first people to get in after the invasion. And I took my 16mm camera and filmed it all, and got arrested by the Russians and interrogated in Russian.
It's like that over there.
So that was that one. Then there was one called The Golden Warrior, about William the Conqueror, which would have been extremely difficult to do. That was the one that went to Michael Winner.
Why The Golden Warrior?
We were approached by the authoress, who liked It Happened Here very much and thought this is the way to make this one. And it is a pretty exciting story if you can work out how to shoot it on a low budget. But the one that that I really nearly excuse me the one that nearly got made, which I would very much like to have made, was about Hollywood in the early years, with Alan Dwan, Raoul Walsh on one side, Victor Fleming, and Erich von Stroheim on the other, and the arrival of producers. And that was a comedy, as authentic as we could make it. And Robert Redford considered it for a while, but he decided to do The Great Waldo Pepper instead, and ours was dropped, and Peter Bogdanovich made something along the same lines. So that was the end of that. That was going to be called Shooting Tomorrow on the Western Street. And the one I was really fond of was about the BBC Great War series. An old man is brought up to be interviewed for it, and it turns out he really had enjoyed himself. He really had a wonderful time. He liked the First World War so much, and when it was over, he joined the Black and Tans and was sent to Ireland. And it was about all that, and that was called All Over Bar the Shouting.
Because you have an Irish background, don't you?
But nobody wanted to back that, and United Artists called it downbeat, which I accused them of using as a euphemism for serious. Anyway, that was that's about all I can remember, but it was enough. Those projects keep you, take up an awful lot of your life.
You ever tried television for them? Was it not possible for the TV?
I did do a television documentary, which was the most awful. This was before Hollywood, and one of the reasons I didn't want to work for television. It was the worst experience of my career, bar nothing. This was a very distinguished producer, who had better remain nameless, who said he'd write it, but he never wrote anything except the headings for the sequences, and the deadline for starting was getting closer and closer, and he never wrote anything. I didn't realize what he meant was he'd write it when it was all shot. He'd write the commentary. Oh, great, but where was the rest of the material coming from? Crazy. Anyway.
And was that ever made?
That was made. That was, yeah.
Can you tell us the title or not? Or don't you want to?
Awful. You go and find it, and then funnily enough, it was. They took all the interviews out and released it in the cinemas as a supporting feature. It was very odd. So
we only have the gap to Winstanley. When that happened, what was the gestation period of that?
Well,
that's just been re-released, hasn't it?
I've been fired off this Brown Forbes picture, which had another useful coincidence attached to it. I didn't think much of the script, and I thought that it was necessary to get more accurately observed upper-class dialogue. So I went to I knew some friends from Wales with aristocratic connections were getting married, and I offered to film it so that I could be there and overhear the conversation. And at the reception, I met a couple of red-headed Irish girls, one of whom turned out I would marry. That's Virginia. And she was the daughter of Molly Keane, the Irish novelist. So that did pay off. Then we went to California to the American Film Institute, and I picked up interviewing anybody I could find from the silent era, as I had been doing before. Only this time I got paid for it, which was magic. And there were so many in those days that I used to feel guilty that I wasn't seeing more of them. And I still kick myself over the people I missed. But I did get to an awful lot. And got Sidney Franklin to write his memoirs. And I got Roland V. Lee to write his memoirs. They've never been published, but they sit on my bookshelf. So that took me until 1972, when Moon Hassan, who'd been my assistant in the cutting rooms, became head of the BFI production board, and he sent me a telegram saying, "Come home, your troubles are just beginning." And that was the start of Winstanley, and that took from 1972 to 1975.
And that shot at weekends as well, like
shooting at weekends. We only managed to shoot once or twice during the week because everybody was working. Nobody got paid except the one professional actor, the wonderful Jerome Willis, who played General Fairfax. He was paid the equity minimum.
I was at the premiere at the London Film Festival when it was shown.
Were you really? With Tony Benn and
with hair then, yes.
Yes.
I remember that. But did that get distributed better than it happened here? That
was distributed by the Other Cinema, and it was a much better arrangement altogether. And I was very impressed with what they did at the opening. They not only showed Winstanley, but they showed the films that had influenced it and the films we reacted against, which I thought was the first time that had ever happened, ever. One of the films we reacted against turned out to be far more popular than Winstanley.
What was that?
The Witchfinder General, which I couldn't bear.
Oh really? I thought it was quite a film like Reeves.
Yeah,
So that when it came out as well, I thought it was
I thought
interesting director. He's done Juggernaut the year before with Boris Karloff.
Yes, he's well known as an interesting director, but I can't see it from that film, which I thought was ugh. Anyway, I can't stand horror films.
Well, I think it had something for it, going for it. Very good music.
So they tell me. Yeah.
Music score, but.
So since 1975, no chance of making another film.
Why not?
Well, for the same reason as it happened here. You know, you've got to make money. If you can become a film director if you have a commercial success in any other area. For instance, you can be a successful pop singer like Mike Sarn, and you can become a film director. The only way you can't become a film director is if you don't actually make money.
So, for example, Jonathan Ross' programme on David Lean on Tonight wouldn't be very different to a film that you would make on David Lean, I assume, but you haven't seen it yet, so you can't make a judgment on that yet. But, I mean, that's the film you would like to have done, I assume.
We put it up to the BBC. It was turned down by Mark Thompson himself. 3-part series on David Lean.
Because you've done many films for television over the years, for Turner as well, I think, haven't you?
Yes, since joining Thames in 1975, we did that 13-part series, and then we did Chaplin, Keaton, Lloyd, Griffith, and I start to run out. Oh, Cinema Europe, which was although we got 13 hours for Hollywood, we only got 6 hours for the whole of Europe. So we had to jettison Russia, for instance, which is ridiculous, but that's the only way we could bring it in under 6 hours.
And then you opened, was it Photoplay?
Well, Photoplay opened in 1990, so it's almost 20 years ago. It's unbelievable. And they gave us, Thames gave us Griffith to, tide us over. That was 3 hours. And then came Cinema Europe. And we did Chaplin and Hitler and Lon Chaney and Cecil B. DeMille. But it's and Garbo and Marion C. Cooper, and then it dried up. And for the last 3 years, it's been arid, to put it mildly.
But you had the series also, you had the Thames Silence, didn't you, which you did?
Yes, David and Carl thought it would be a great idea to put back into the cinema something that had been lost, which is the silent film with live orchestra. But the first film they chose was Broken Blossoms. Jeremy Isaacs had gone to Channel 4, and the new producer thought it was too corny. So they had the idea of Napoleon. Wonder what would happen if we tried that.
Tell us a bit about how that came about.
It's hard to talk about Napoleon now because we've had such a hard time with Coppola, Francis Ford Coppola.
That's still happening, is it?
And Bob Harris, and it's and that would take about 6 magazines all by themselves.
Didn't Annabella come to?
Yes, Annabella came. The first showing of that sort in Paris at the Palais de Congrès had a whole lineup of people connected with the film on the stage at the end, including editors, assistants, and we had several of the actors, and Annabella, yeah.
It was the greatest film experience of my life, actually, going to see Napoleon. Is in Leicester Square, I think I saw it, with the flu. I remember.
Okay.
But it was I had never seen a film lasting, was it 5 hours or
Yes.
was it longer? It was with the intervals, but it was a complete revelation actually. But I was wondering how that coming together of that 5 hour film, how long that took to do, and how many years it took you to actually put that together.
This is talking of Ernest Lindgren. I think Colin Ford was the deputy curator, and I just finished The Charm of Dynamite. And while I was making it, Gans said, ask Mary Epstein, who oddly enough was the sister of Jean Epstein, who'd made Lion of the Moguls, which had started all this off. Ask Mary Epstein for the film of us making the film. I really thought he'd taken leave of his senses. But I asked her, and she just shrugged and went off, came back with a pile of rusty cans, and I opened the top one when she went out for some more, and the first thing I found was a roll about that big, and the moment I looked at it, I recognized it as the long-lost Snowball fight, which my pet book, which had told me about my Douglas Fairbanks film, also told me was one of the greatest examples of rapid cutting there had ever been. And it was never there. So when she came back, I asked her if we could look at that on the flatbed, and I count that as one of the greatest moments of my life. I was absolutely drained at the end of that 3 or 4 minutes of intense rapid cutting. Rapid cutting is a style I particularly liked and had tried to do myself without any success. But to see it done by a master, and then it had been missing for all these decades, and I realized this has to be put back. And I told Gans about it, and he said, oh, I'd like that, because he was doing his yet another version. Can you get that for me? Because he says it's so difficult. You need one revolver for Longwan, one revolver for Merriest to get anything out of them. So I ordered it as though it was for my program. 2 prints, gave him one of them. And then Napoleon was included in a program that Tom Milne organised called The Real Avant-Garde. And I remember I was romancing an American girl at the time, and I wanted her to be knocked out by this, so I took her to it. And it was one of the worst experiences I can imagine, because it was made out of outtakes, put together by somebody who didn't know what they were doing. And some of the outtakes were repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats, going on for hours. And I walked out, couldn't stand it. And I realized that this film had to be restored. And it was then shown again at the National Film Theatre. And this time it was the best print they had. That one was not. The best print the Cinematheque had. And so a friend and myself plotted to get into the projection box and get that film out into the lab and back into the projection box again. And I do not know how we did it. We did it. And Studio Film Labs mercifully did a very good job of copying it. And I put back that snowball fight as the first stage. And then there was a multi-screen festival, and the organisers, George Dunning, who'd made The Yellow Submarine, ordered the triptych to be sent. And when all that was over, he said that he'd sent it back, and I was very disappointed. He said, but I copied it first. You'd better look after the negative. So now I had a basic print of the film and starting to put the sequences back, and I had the triptych ending.